Okay, so I'm back, and this is part 2 of our Anki series, in which we try to replicate the program Anki. Now, in the previous video, we created a basic program, and what the program does is it has a button. When you click the button, the text changes to clicked, and it prints out clicked over here. Now, obviously, this is a nice program, but it's not like Anki. So in this video, we are going to be making it much more like Anki, so that we can get one step closer to our goal. Let's start. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to move this line self.show and paste it over here, right after we call the window. Now, obviously, we can't call it self.show anymore. You have to rename it win.show. So, currently, our main class hasn't got lots of code. But later on, it's going to start getting much more advanced and complex. And therefore, I would like to keep the code in it to a minimum, which is why I've moved the self.show out here. Now, the reason we can rename a win.show is, if you remember over here, self.show means my window.show, because over here we define my window as self, and over here we define my window as win. So win.show is the same as my window.show, and my window is the same as self over here. And so that's just how I got from self.show to win.show, just in case you didn't understand. The next thing we want to do is we want to actually resize the GUI, because currently it's much smaller than Anki. If we can see, it's got a width of 500 and a height of 500. Remember, these two are just where it will be created on the screen, and so they're unnecessary for now. Let's focus on these two. So, estimating, I think Anki is roughly 1000 wide and 800 tall. Let's see. So if we compare that to Anki, oops, it's a bit small. I think I'll change this to 1400 and the height to 1000. Let's see if this works then. So it's bigger, and oops. Yeah, it's basically there. I think I'll just remove it from 1400 to 1350 and change the height from 1000 to 1070. Oops. Here, 1070. Okay, so now we've got an average sized GUI. The next thing we need to do is create this bar at the top. So there are two main ways we can go on doing that. Number one, we can create a button and delete the whole button feature, just create a clickable button which appears as text, if that makes sense. The other way we can do it, which is the way I'm going to do it, is by creating labels. Now, really quickly, let me show you what a label is. Self.lbl is equal to qt widget dot q label self. self.lvl.set text text, and then self.lbl.move 300. That's the coordinates where it will appear on the GUI. So comparing a label to a button, this is a button, this is a label. Labels are pure text with nothing else. They're just text, and we'll be using labels. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to delete the button because we don't need it. That was just for a basic example of PyQt. The next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to rename it from label to self.deck label. If we copy this, so we have a variable deck label, which is a label. We can also rename it from text to dex, because as you can see in Anki, the first variable or the first label is called dex. Now, what we can do is we can now copy this and create 5 of them. We can also change them. So let's see. Next we have add, browse, stats, and sync. So we can quickly go add, browse, stats, and sync. Now we also need to rename the variables because they're 5 separate widgets and therefore are 5 separate variables themselves. So we can change this from deck label to add label. We can change this to browse label. We can change the 4th one to oops, I cannot spell today. Stats label. And we can change the last one to sync label. Now we also need to change the positioning because currently we're moving every single one to the point 300, 300. So I'll show you what that looks like. As you can see, it looks ugly because they're all trying to go into the same position, they're all overlapping, and it's just a mess. So what we'll do is we actually need to change all of them. Firstly, the height should be roughly 50, because if you look, this is roughly 50 pixels underneath. So 50. Then we can change this one in accordance to the actual size. So for now, I think I'll set this to roughly 350, and I'll increment them all by 100. So this one will be 450, 550, 650, and finally 750. So let's run this. Okay, so now we've actually spaced them out and it looks similar to Anki. I mean, obviously we need to change the font, we need to tweak up the positioning, but it's getting there. Now, here's the problem. When we full screen this, the widgets don't stay in the middle, they move. The reason being is because now this point over here is the widget's 350. Now, we could, technically speaking, do some very advanced maths to divide the whole length and get each label size and put it in accordance and run this function every time the main window is resized, but that's long and complex. An easier way to do it is using layouts. So what a layout is it's a way of putting a bunch of widgets together and choosing what happens when the widget resizes and everything. It's a bit hard to explain, so I'll write the code and I'll show you what it looks like. First, we want to create a variable called self.hbox, and we'll set this to a qt widgets.qhbox layout. Now, the H, as you probably guessed, stands for horizontal, meaning this layout is going to work horizontal. Next, we're going to add a widget to self.hbox, and this widget is going to be self.deck. Oops. Oh, now the function there. Deck label. Now we're just going to add all of our widgets in. Self.add label, self.h box.add widget, self.browse label, self.hbox.add widget, self.stats label, and finally .hbox.widget self.sync label. Now, we can run this, but nothing's going to happen. I'll show you. So we've got our GUI, and the labels are still appearing. Sorry. The labels are still appearing because we're still moving them to those positions. We're not going to need that anymore after we've implemented the layout. Okay, so now, if I run the code, we can see that the widgets just appear at the bottom, at the top corner, and the layout is not working. The reason being is because all we've done is we've just created a simple layout. We haven't added it to the class. Now, some people would think all we have to do is go, okay, self.set layout self.hbox, and go, okay, well that worked. You're setting the layout to the main window. That's fine. In PyQt, you cannot set the layout to a main window. You have to create a separate widget and add the layout to that widget. So what we do is, right at the beginning, we go widget, short for widget, is equal to qt widgets.q widget self, because it has the self variable. Now we're going to run self.set central widgets with. Now what this does is this essentially creates a blank widget called width, and it sets width to fill the whole screen. So all we'll see now is width. If that makes sense. Then, instead of self.setLayout, we can run width.setLayout, setting the layout to the widget. Now, if we run this, we can see that actually the layout works. And I'll show you what the layout does. Okay, so as you can see, the layouts added all 5 different widgets, and it spaced them out so that they all fit the screen. And as you can see, if we full screen it, they stay in their proportions. We can resize it, and it will automatically update. Now this is good and everything, but it doesn't look much like this top bar yet. So let's fix that. The first thing we can do is we can align the layout to the top using self.hbox.setAlignment qtcore.qt.align top. Now, if you remember in the last video, we imported Qt core from PyQt. Now, Qt core has an element called Qt, and Qt holds all of the different alignment options you have. So we could use, instead of align top, align center, or align left, or even align absolute, anything. But for this reason, we're just going to stick with align top. Now, if we run it, we can see that it's all been aligned to the top. But we still have a problem. In Anki, this part over here, it's all blank, and we need to add that. Now, that in itself isn't actually that hard. What we do is we go self.hbox.add stretch. We run that before the first widget, and we add the same thing after the first widget. After the last widget, sorry. Now, a stretch is basically a giant gap of blankness. It'll just be blank. Now, because we're adding it at the front and at the back, it creates a giant stretch as much as it can on both sides. Now, what do we mean by as much as it can? It creates so much that all that's left will be the 5 widgets and whatever spacing we set between them. So the default spacing, I think, is something ridiculously small, like 10 pixels. And as you can see, we now have blank lines of blankness on both sides. If we full screen it, it stays in proportion and it stays in the center. So the last thing we need to do is we just need to edit the spacing between the labels, which is also very simple to do. All you want to add right at the beginning is self.hbox.set spacing 60 pixels. Now, if we run it, you can see that, look, they have a much larger spacing between them, and they're at the top, and when we full screen it, they stay in their proportions in the center. Comparing it to Anki, we could see that they're actually very similar. Now, that's probably a wrap for this video. As you can see, we created labels, we made them at the top, add stretches to both sides, and set the spacing between them. In the next one, we're most likely going to be adding these lines and changing the font of each label. We might even get enough time to start using this add feature and creating a completely separate window. Now, I really hope you liked this, and if you did, then please like. Other than that, stay safe, and I'll see you again in the next videos. Bye.